Today we're getting started on my 18th century historically adequate witch. Now, I've loved this sketch for a while. It's an awesome idea, it's a lot of fun, and in order to make the outfit actually get the shape that's in the sketch that would be common in the 18th century, I need to start from the inside out. That means I have to start with underwear. Now, I don't have much experience with 18th century anything besides pockets and skirts because they're easy and I like them. So I went ahead and got the American Duchess Guide to Dressmaking, and I'm going to be using it to make the under-petticoat using historical techniques. Now, I had originally planned on doing this with an old bed sheet, but according to the American Duchess instructions, I want something that's a little bit heavier to help give the skirts a little bit more body. So I dug in my stash and I found this kind of boring plain cotton canvas. It's not canvas like tent canvas. It's not super thick. It's actually kind of soft. I had purchased it originally to make pants for my dad for a Renaissance fair, and I think it's going to work really, really nicely for that under petticoat. So we're going to go ahead and get started on that so I can start building up my layers. As we get started here, the very first thing I need to do is get my fabric prepared. Now, this fabric has been in my stash for quite some time. It has already been pre-washed. I like to do that with my fabrics as soon as I get them anyway. If you pre-wash your fabrics right out the gate, that means that they are always ready to go when you want them. The thing that I do like to do, though, is trim the cut edge. A lot of the times when you get fabric, the edge that gets cut off the bolt gets kind of wiggly, and when you want things to be neat and straight for hem purposes, for example, you don't really want to have that kind of wobbly edge. So I will use a combination of my rulers. I've got my clear quilting ruler that I can line up with the grid on my cutting mat, and then I can use that to balance out my long metal black ruler. It's fantastic. It makes a great edge to run my rotary cutter against. And by using all of those things together, I can get the straightest possible line across the bottom of that fabric. I do tend to be really careful when I'm using my rotary cutter. I don't trust them. Rotary cutters and I tend to have some problems. A lot of the times what I'm cutting against for that straight edge will wiggle, and then I'll end up with a lot of extra cuts that aren't necessarily square that I didn't want. So I'm always very careful to make sure that my cutting edge is as secure as possible. You'll see I didn't need to take a whole bunch off of this one. It was cut pretty cleanly, but now that edge is ready to be used for anything I need it for. It'll be an even hem edge, it'll be an even waist edge. Now I can prepare to cut my skirt panels, but because this fabric is really wide and I want to be able to use the grid on my cutting mat to make sure I'm getting nice straight lines, I'm actually folding the fabric in half, selvage edge to selvage edge. That means it will fit evenly across my cutting mat here. And once I get it all smoothed out, that's something that can be a little bit tricky when you're using a longer piece of fabric like this. You do need to get it smooth for quite a distance away from where you're going to cut, just to make sure that everything stays smooth and stays even and you're not introducing any bubbles or wobbles to your fabric. Using the grid like this, though, can be really nice. I have numbers on either side of the fabric this way, and I can use that to square my ruler with. The other nice thing about this particular grid is that I can use those grids to very easily count how much space I need for whatever it is I'm doing. So I can count up my fabric length, make note of what number that was lining up with, and then go ahead and take my magical giant ruler, take that across where I need it to go, checking some of the edges to make sure that they're still square, and now I can secure that ruler. Again, I like to kneel on it and I like to put as much of my body weight on it as I can. That will get me a nice secure edge to cut along with my rotary cutter and see about getting it all neat and clean. One of the things I do run into with rotary cutters, though, is every now and then they don't cut all the way through like you would like them to. So it's always nice to have your scissors on hand to clean those cuts up and make sure that you can get your fabric free. Once I have both of my skirt panels cut, I'm staying on my cutting mat in the kitchen because it's large and it's flat, and that will let me pin the seams for this nice and neatly. It's a little bit easier to manage the fabric when you can lay it out on a flat surface like this. I also need to measure for the back opening of the skirt. It will be seamed completely on one of the two panels, and then on the second seam, it goes down about 10 inches to leave an opening. Now that I've got all of my seams pinned, it's time to start sewing. I have already waxed some cotton thread and loaded up my needle because I intend to hand sew this. I measure out my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and when I sew, I will be following a single thread across the entire edge of the garment. I will stop and check periodically because your eyes get a little crossed sometimes while you're trying to follow a single thread. I like to check and make sure that I'm not drifting over much. You absolutely can do this on a sewing machine instead. It is a lot faster. I really enjoy hand sewing though, so at any available opportunity, if I can hand sew something, I usually will, especially if I'm not in a particular rush for it. Once I have my thread anchored, I'm going to be stitching this entire seam using a back stitch, and it should go along quite nicely. It is nice that this fabric is a little bit coarser. It does make following that single thread a little bit easier. I go a little bit slower when I'm getting started and kind of getting a hang for it, but you can see the back stitch progresses quite nicely and should give me a nice, tight, sturdy seam. I'm ready to start pressing out seams on my petticoat, and I'm doing something a little bit differently. This is where the back opening for the petticoat will go, and you'll notice I've got it pinned with my favorite glass-headed pins. This is so when I press open the rest of the seam, this is about 1/2 inch, and it will press out with the rest of that, because the next step will be stitching this down and making a nice clean opening. This way everything gets pressed at once and the line stays nice and flat. So that's the first press, and then this is the press to open everything up. Once it cools, it'll be all ready to stitch down and have a nice clean opening. With my seam allowance pressed out, I can start to secure the back opening. I will running stitch along the opening to baste the seam allowances down so that I can work on them a little bit more. This helps secure it for the next step where I'll hide all of the little floofy bits. But something that I like to do anytime I have to cross a seam like this, particularly one where it's going to be interacted with when the fabric is pulled over my body, is give that seam a little bit of reinforcement. So I'm going to do a couple of back stitches across that seam just to make sure that it's being held in place, because that's kind of a weak point. It's really easy to accidentally pop that seam open more, and I don't really want to split my skirt. So once that's done, I can continue with the basting, and then I can go through and whip stitch around the edge. I use my needle to tuck the fluffy bits in. It's a lot easier than trying to pin it, and it gives me just as nice and clean of a finish that way. Now that I have the back opening all clean and tidy, it's time to move on to hemming the skirt. It's presently a lovely skirt-shaped tube, and I will be doing the hem before I will be doing the waist while all the fabric is as full as it can be. It's a little bit easier to manage at this point. So I'm turning up 1/2 an inch all the way around the hem of this skirt. That is actually half of my seam allowance for this. The full seam allowance is an inch. This is going to be a turned hem, but it's done a little bit differently from what I've seen in the past. I'm not sure if this is exclusively an 18th century thing or not, but you pin up the hem, you baste it down, and then you pin it up again. And I'm finding that that makes really nice, crisp seams. I've really liked how everything I've done this way has turned out so far. It does take a little bit longer because I'm effectively sewing the hem twice, but I definitely think that the output of this is well worth it. As I turn the hem up here, I can really feel how crisp and clean this edge is, and I think that is in large part due to the fact that it was basted down first. I like to secure my whip stitches for the final hemming portion with a couple basically like back whip stitches before I go all the way along. I will pin this a little bit to make sure that I don't have fabric slipping away as I'm going. And I am actually trying to sew to the number of stitches that would historically have been used. So I will pick up a ruler from time to time and check and make sure. I think at this point I'm aiming for 10 to 12 stitches per inch. That is a lot more whip stitches that I am accustomed to using, and is probably the reason why on some of the things that I've hemmed similarly to this, I tend to get the heels of my shoes caught in the hem. I think I was setting those stitches too wide in an effort to get them done, so that tight stitch is definitely worth it. I have my pleats up next. I'm using my centering ruler. I can line the 0 in the middle of the ruler up with my center seam, and that will make sure that I can get everything even on both sides so my skirt will be symmetrical. The blue mark that you see is half of my waist measurement from that 0 mark. When I start doing the pleating, because they're not measured except for the first one, that will help me make sure that I haven't used up too much or too little fabric. I have a visual representation to get my waist correct. The first pleat in the center is a box pleat that is 3 inches wide, so I'm doing 1.5 inches on either side of that center seam, and I'm securing the pleat in 2 places. If you only do the top edge, the rest of your fabric can float a little bit, and I find that it often makes the edge that you're pleating curve, which I don't want. I want this to be as square as possible. So by using a pin a little bit further down, I help make sure that the fabric doesn't cause any extra drift. The fun part about this is that there isn't really a guide to how many pleats you should use. You just kind of get to eyeball it. I'm lucky in that I've done a lot of skirts like this, so I'm pretty good at eyeballing it, and I did guess correctly on this one and had it work out just fine for me. I picked a width that I thought looked nice and worked along that until I got nearer to the end, and that's where that blue tape comes into play. Once I start securing those outer edges for the pleats, I can line up my center mark, see how much space I still have, and then use that to adjust to bring that waistline in exactly where I need it. That final pleat might be a little wonky, but this is underwear, so that's okay. Once the pleats are all the way around the top of the skirt, it's time to secure them. Sewing a waistband with lots of extra pins in the way can get really stabby and pokey and is just no fun. So I am going to be back stitching the edge of the pleats all the way around. I'm working about 1/4 inch down, and I'm doing my best to catch every layer to help hold those pleats in place and keep them nice and secure. That will allow me to remove all of the pins when I go to put the waistband on and make it a little bit easier to handle. It also gives it an extra layer of security to help keep those pleats in place in case I step on a skirt edge or pull on something. I'm going to have that extra stability for those pleats. And that takes us to the waistband. For this pattern, I'm using a waist tape that's going to get folded over the top edge of the skirt. It's going to cover up that raw edge where all the pleats are made. I secure the tape to the center of the skirt first and then work my way out and around. That can be really helpful to making sure that your waistband stays the correct length on both sides. By folding it in half and pinning it to the center and then working out, you ensure that the tails that you leave for ties are the length that you actually want them to be. I tend to indicate this with a different color pin. You'll notice most of my pins are white. Those are my glass-headed pins, but that yellow pin was what I was using to mark as center because it looks so much different from my other pins. It's a great visual cue. And then once the waistband is secured in place, I can start whip stitching it down. I'm checking again to see about where an inch is on that so that I can make sure that I'm getting close to the number of called for stitches per inch. I don't really know what happens if you go too high or too low around that. It probably doesn't make a huge difference, but since I've never done this before, I figure I might as well try to get the requisite stitch lengths taken care of. And I will be whipping all the way around this before I turn the waist edge over. Second verse, same as the first, only this time I'm folding the waist tape over that raw edge. I'm making sure to squeeze it down so that it covers the basting stitch line that is holding all of my pleats together. That just gives it a neater, cleaner finish. And then it is time for more whip stitches. So as I usually do, I'll do a few whips on one little section and I'll work my way down across the entire edge, doing my best to achieve the stitch per inch count that the pattern recommends and get in a little bit more practice with my whip stitches. There are an awful lot of them in this pattern, so it's a good thing that I enjoy doing them. You don't really have to think about them, you just kind of grab and go. And it does give a really nice finish. I must admit, I really like the finish that I got on this waistband. I think having that larger number of stitches per inch than what I would usually do for this gives a much neater, cleaner finish, and it's probably a lot more sturdy, which is great because that should make any garments that I do this way last a lot longer. So that is a fun and positive lessons learned. I now have a petticoat. I'm surprised with how well this has worked out. I was expecting the fabric to be really rough and scratchy. It's not as soft as some of my other linens and cottons are, but it flows really nicely. It fits reasonably well. I do need to bring it in just a little bit. I'm going to have to unpick part of the waistband to deepen some pleats because I've got a little bit more space here than is really good for the fit. It needs to be just a little bit more snug, maybe an inch, so that shouldn't be too difficult. Now I'm ready to layer my stays over this so I can get to work on the next layer, which is my purple petticoat. I have to get that done before I can do the jacket that goes over that because the skirt of the jacket has to go over everything. So join me back here and we'll be getting started on that. I'll see you soon.